Elijah Reed, a successful black CEO, becomes the target of a corrupt white police officer, Officer Daniels, who fabricates evidence to destroy his reputation. Fueled by blatant racism and prejudice, Daniels leverages his authority to humiliate and discredit Elijah, believing the system will protect him. The story explores the insidious ways racism and abuse of power manifest, from microaggressions to overt discrimination, as Elijah fights to clear his name in a courtroom filled with tension. This gripping tale of injustice shines a harsh light on systemic racism in America, leaving viewers outraged and questioning the cost of entrenched biases. The hum of early morning city life filtered through the open windows of the Sullivan home, where light streamed onto the kitchen table. Meredith Sullivan, a nurse with a calm demeanor born from years of late-night shifts and emergencies, flipped pancakes with practiced ease. Her husband, Victor, a high school teacher passionate about molding young minds, leaned against the counter, sipping coffee and watching their youngest daughter, Ellie, meticulously cut fruit into geometric shapes. "Ellie," he teased, his smile warm, "if you cut those any smaller, we'll need a microscope to eat breakfast." Ellie grinned, her eyes sparkling with a mix of mischief and precision. "Presentation is everything, Dad." Across the room, her older brother, Jamie, glanced up from his laptop, where a spreadsheet filled with travel itineraries and packing lists flickered on the screen. The family's long-awaited road trip to the national park was finally here. A getaway they had planned for months to reconnect after a challenging year. Meredith flipped the last pancake onto a plate and set it on the table. "Breakfast first, itinerary later," she said, placing a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "This trip isn't just about schedules, it's about us, okay?" Jamie gave a sheepish nod, pushing his glasses higher on his nose. "Got it, Mom." As they settled into their meal, the anticipation of the journey ahead filled the room. Yet, as much as the trip symbolized a reprieve from the chaos of daily life, none of them could foresee the unexpected turn it would take, a moment that would test their unity and redefine their understanding of strength. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as sunlight spilled through the large bay windows of Joe's Diner, a small but well-loved establishment nestled in the heart of Darlington, a town known more for its sprawling farmland than for its bustling commerce. The morning rush hummed along, with clinking dishes and the low murmur of conversation creating a warm, welcoming buzz. Inside, customers sat at booths adorned with faded red vinyl, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs and scanning newspapers folded neatly at their sides. At a corner table near the window, Elijah Reed sat quietly, his dark eyes scanning the pages of a weathered paperback. The faintest hint of a smile played on his lips as he sipped his coffee. Black, no sugar, just as he liked it. To anyone passing by, he could have been just another customer, enjoying a moment of quiet in a busy morning. The neatly pressed button-up shirt, unassuming slacks, and scuffed brown loafers completed the picture of someone simple, humble, even ordinary. But Elijah Reed was far from ordinary. As the CEO of one of the nation's leading tech firms, Pinnacle Systems, Elijah had risen from modest beginnings to lead an empire of innovation that spanned the globe. Known for his brilliance and quiet determination, he'd become a celebrated figure in business and philanthropy alike. His company's projects had revolutionized industries, but it was his work beyond the boardroom, funding STEM education for underserved communities and championing equity initiatives, that cemented his reputation as a man of principle. Yet, in the simplicity of Joe's Diner, none of that mattered, and that was exactly how Elijah preferred it. He adjusted his reading glasses and flipped a page in his book, a biography of a 19th-century abolitionist he admired around him. The din of the diner carried on the waitress behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, poured refills with practiced efficiency, occasionally pausing to chat with regulars. A farmer, still in overalls from his early morning chores, gestured animatedly as he spoke to the man across from him, who laughed deeply in response. Darlington, like so many small towns, held a peculiar charm, a mix of familiarity and resistance to change. It wasn't a place where Elijah stood out, which he appreciated. His modest upbringing in a similar town had instilled in him a deep respect for people who worked hard and valued community. Still, beneath its friendly surface, Darlington bore the same undercurrents of systemic bias and quiet prejudice that Elijah had encountered throughout his life. It was the kind of place where people liked to think they were past such things, even as they clung to old assumptions that whispered otherwise. The door jingled as it opened, and Elijah glanced up briefly. A pair of men in dark suits entered, their polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Their confident strides and crisp attire set them apart from the rest of the diner's clientele. One carried a sleek leather briefcase, and the other adjusted the lapels of his suit as they surveyed the room. Elijah recognized them instantly: David Carmichael, a high-powered attorney, and his associate, Mark Lively, were familiar faces in Darlington's legal circles. Pinnacle Systems had retained their firm for a few projects, though Elijah had always preferred to handle matters with his in-house counsel. The two men exuded authority, the kind that often went unquestioned, particularly in spaces like these. Elijah returned his attention to his book, but a flicker of curiosity remained. He was rarely recognized in casual settings like this, and he doubted the men would notice him. Most people saw only what they expected to see. Still, as their voices carried across the room, he couldn't help but listen. "Doesn't look like much of a crowd today," Carmichael said, his tone edged with a faint condescension as he scanned the room. Lively chuckled. "Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect anyone important." Elijah's lips quirked upward at the comment, amused by its irony. He turned another page, though his attention was divided. Moments like these were subtle but familiar. Instances where people overlooked him, mistaking his deliberate humility for ordinariness. He had long since learned not to take offense. Instead, he saw them as quiet opportunities to observe, to better understand, the assumptions people carried with them. "Excuse me," Carmichael's voice broke into his thoughts. Elijah looked up to find the attorney standing at his table, his gaze appraising. "Yes?" Elijah replied, his tone polite but unassuming. "We're looking for Elijah Reed," Carmichael said, glancing down at the book on the table as though it might offer some clue. "We were told he'd be here for a meeting, but I think there's been some confusion." Elijah tilted his head slightly, closing his book with deliberate calm. "You've found him." Carmichael blinked, his confident demeanor faltering for just a moment. "You're Elijah Reed?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I am," Elijah confirmed, rising to his full height and extending a hand. His handshake was firm, his gaze steady. Carmichael recovered quickly, though his smile now seemed forced. "Ah, of course. My apologies, I didn't realize." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral. "Didn't realize what?" The attorney hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Well, I suppose I didn't expect—" He trailed off, clearing his throat. "Anyway, it's a pleasure to meet you." Elijah gestured to the seat across from him. "Shall we sit? I believe we have business to discuss." As Carmichael and Lively took their seats, the tension in the air shifted. The easy authority they had walked in with now seemed slightly diminished, replaced by a guarded uncertainty. Elijah noted the subtle discomfort, but chose not to address it. He had spent a lifetime navigating these moments, where perceptions clashed with reality, and he knew better than to let them rattle him. Their conversation began, the three men diving into the details of a proposed partnership that could benefit both Pinnacle Systems and Carmichael's firm. Elijah listened attentively, interjecting occasionally with pointed questions that revealed both his intellect and his understanding of the finer points of the deal. Yet, despite his focus on the matter at hand, he couldn't ignore the undercurrent of unease that lingered between them. At one point, as Carmichael outlined a proposal, Lively glanced toward the waitress, motioning for a coffee refill. "Could you bring some cream, please?" he added, his tone absent-minded. The waitress nodded, her expression polite but strained. Elijah caught the slight furrow of her brow, the faintest flicker of something unspoken in her demeanor. He wondered, not for the first time, how often she'd endured the subtle condescension of customers who saw her only as an extension of her apron, and not as a person in her own right. The conversation continued, the clinking of cups and murmurs of nearby diners forming a backdrop to their discussion. But Elijah's thoughts wandered, reflecting on how often spaces like these became microcosms of larger dynamics. Places where unspoken assumptions played out in ways both small and profound. As the meeting concluded, Carmichael offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Reed. I'll have my office draft the necessary documents and send them your way." Elijah nodded, his expression calm. "I'll review them carefully. Let's ensure the terms align with our mutual goals." Carmichael and Lively rose to leave, their polished demeanor intact, but noticeably less assured than when they'd arrived. As they exited the diner, Elijah resumed his seat, opening his book once more. The waitress approached, refilling his coffee with a quiet smile. "Thanks," he said, his voice warm. "You've got a way of keeping this place running smoothly." She chuckled softly. "Been doing this a long time. You learn how to handle all kinds." Elijah nodded, his respect for her evident. "It shows." As the diner returned to its usual rhythm, Elijah felt a familiar resolve settle within him. The moments of subtle tension, the quiet assumptions, and the resilience of those who moved through them, it all reinforced his purpose. In a world that often tried to define him by its limitations, he knew the power of redefining those boundaries, one quiet act of integrity at a time. The sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time Elijah left Joe's diner, the warmth of the morning now tempered by the faint chill of unease. As he stepped outside, the faint scent of cut grass mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from a nearby bakery. Darlington's main street stretched before him, a tableau of small-town life, with shopkeepers greeting passers-by and children riding bicycles along the sidewalks. Elijah adjusted his watch, a discreet but elegant piece gifted to him years ago when Pinnacle Systems had celebrated a decade of success. He needed to make one more stop before heading back to his office, a quick visit to a local hardware store to pick up supplies for a small home project he'd promised to help his sister with. The bell above the door jingled as Elijah entered the store, the earthy scent of lumber and metallic tang of tools filling the air. A middle-aged man in a plaid shirt leaned against the counter, chatting casually with a younger clerk. They glanced up as Elijah walked in, their eyes briefly narrowing before they returned to their conversation. Elijah scanned the aisles, quickly locating the screws and tools he needed. As he moved through the store, he couldn't help but notice the way the younger clerk's gaze seemed to follow him, darting away whenever Elijah caught his eye. It wasn't the first time he'd experienced this kind of silent scrutiny. The implicit suspicion that often came with walking into unfamiliar spaces as a black man, no matter how well-dressed or unassuming. At the counter, Elijah placed his items down and offered a polite nod. "Morning?" The older man, whose name tag identified him as Greg, gave a brief nod in return, but didn't smile. "Morning?" The younger clerk lingered nearby, his body language tense. Elijah noticed the subtle shift in Greg's demeanor as he began ringing up the items, his tone clipped and perfunctory. When Elijah handed over his credit card, Greg paused, his eyes flicking to the name embossed on it. "Elijah Reed," Greg said slowly, as though testing the name on his tongue. "You're not from around here, are you?" "I've visited a few times," Elijah replied, his tone neutral. "I've got family in the area." Greg nodded, though his expression remained guarded. He held onto the card a fraction longer than necessary before swiping it. "Well, welcome to Darlington," he said, though the words lacked warmth. "We're a tight-knit community around here." Elijah gave a polite smile, understanding the unspoken implication. He gathered his bag and thanked Greg before leaving, his composure intact despite the subtle unease gnawing at him. As he stepped back onto the street, he noticed a patrol car idling nearby, its occupant, a young officer, watching him intently. Elijah's steps slowed as he locked eyes with the officer for a moment before continuing toward his car. The sound of the engine starting behind him made him glance back. The patrol car pulled out of its spot, trailing slowly behind him as he crossed the street. Elijah let out a slow breath, the familiar weight of suspicion settling on his shoulders. By the time Elijah reached his car, the patrol car had pulled up behind him. The officer stepped out, a man in his late 20s, with a closely shaved head and a belt weighed down by gear. He adjusted his hat and approached Elijah with measured steps, his expression unreadable. "Morning," the officer said, his voice even. "This your vehicle?" "Yes," Elijah replied calmly, keeping his hands visible. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Mind if I see your license and registration?" the officer asked, his tone casual but firm. Elijah's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he nodded, reaching for his wallet and the glove compartment. "Of course, may I ask why you're stopping me?" The officer didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning Elijah's car. Just a routine check, he said after a moment. We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the area. Elijah handed over his documents, his movements deliberate. I see well. Everything should be in order. The officer took the papers and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Elijah standing beside his vehicle. The minutes stretched on, each one amplifying the tension. Elijah glanced around, noticing how the scene was beginning to draw attention. A few pedestrians slowed their steps, their curious gazes lingering as they passed. When the officer finally returned, his demeanor was less neutral, more clipped. Everything checks out, he said, handing the documents back. Just make sure you're not lingering around where you don't need to be. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained measured. Is there something specific you're concerned about? Officer, I'd like to understand why I was stopped. The officer's expression hardened. Like I said, routine check. You're free to go. Elijah nodded, holding the officer's gaze for a moment, before sliding back into his car. As he drove away, the frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. These moments, so small in isolation, accumulated over time, a series of microaggressions and overt acts of mistrust that underscored the systemic biases he had spent his life pushing against. Later that afternoon, Elijah arrived at a community center in the neighboring city for a panel discussion on equity in education. The event had been organized by a local nonprofit, and Elijah was the keynote speaker, invited to share insights from his philanthropic initiatives. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as attendees filled the rows of folding chairs, their conversations a mix of admiration and curiosity. As Elijah took the stage, he felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with addressing an audience. He spoke about the transformative power of access and opportunity, sharing stories of young students whose lives had been changed by programs funded through his foundation. His words were met with nods of agreement and bursts of applause, the energy in the room electric. Yet, even here, there were moments that hinted at the undercurrents of bias. During the Q&A session, a man in a crisp suit raised his hand and, when called upon, said, "Mr. Reed, it's impressive what you've accomplished. But do you ever worry that programs like yours create dependency rather than empowerment?" Elijah's smile didn't falter, though the question struck a familiar chord. "That's an important question," he began, his tone steady. "What we've found is that opportunity isn't about creating dependency. It's about leveling the playing field. These programs don't hand out success. They provide the tools for individuals to build it themselves. And if you look at the outcomes, you'll see that the students we've supported are thriving, not just surviving." The man nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. Elijah continued, undeterred, knowing that every answer, every interaction, was a chance to challenge perceptions and plant seeds of understanding. As the event concluded and attendees began to disperse, Elijah lingered near the stage, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. A young woman approached, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice tentative but determined. "Thank you for what you said today. It means a lot to see someone like you, someone who's made it, speaking out about these issues." Elijah's smile softened. "Thank you. I believe we all have a role to play in creating change, no matter where we are." As she walked away, Elijah reflected on the day's events, the subtle biases, the overt mistrust, and the moments of connection that reminded him why he did this work. He knew the challenges weren't over. If anything, they were only just beginning, but he also knew that the fight for equity and dignity required resilience, and he was ready to meet it head-on. The crisp evening air carried the hum of passing cars as Elijah pulled into the community center's parking lot. The day's events had left a faint tension thrumming in his chest, a quiet storm he kept at bay with deep breaths and practiced composure. Tonight, he was due to attend a private reception for key donors and community leaders, a gathering designed to celebrate the achievements of the education initiative he had championed. Elijah stepped out of his car, adjusting his blazer as he approached the glass-fronted building inside. The space was abuzz with conversation and laughter. Clusters of attendees milled about, glasses of champagne in hand, their voices blending into a symphony of optimism and camaraderie. But Elijah's practiced smile faltered slightly as he noticed Officer Daniels standing near the entrance, his stance rigid, his expression unreadable. Daniels was one of Darlington's more senior officers, known for his strict demeanor and unwavering adherence to rules. At least when it suited him, Elijah had encountered him once before, during a tense city council meeting where Daniels had voiced opposition to one of Pinnacle Systems' community outreach projects. His rhetoric had been cloaked in neutrality, but his disdain for Elijah's efforts was unmistakable. Daniels approached as Elijah entered, blocking his path with a casual but deliberate step. "Mr. Reed," Daniels said, his voice cool, "didn't expect to see you here tonight." Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I was invited, officer. Is there a problem?" Daniels shrugged, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Just making sure everything's in order. You know how it is? Small towns, lots of moving parts." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course, have a good evening, officer." As he stepped past, Elijah caught the way Daniels' eyes followed him, a silent challenge hanging in the air. He pushed the moment aside and moved deeper into the room, greeting familiar faces and shaking hands. The reception was in full swing, the clinking of glasses and soft jazz music creating a veneer of celebration that belied the unease that lingered in Elijah's thoughts. An hour into the event, the mood shifted. Elijah had just finished a conversation with a local journalist when a commotion near the entrance drew his attention. He turned to see Officer Daniels, flanked by two other uniformed officers, their presence cutting through the convivial atmosphere. Like a blade, Daniels' eyes found Elijah, and he began making his way across the room, his expression grim. "Elijah Reed," Daniels announced loudly, his voice carrying over the subdued music and murmured conversations. "We need to speak with you." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment crashing down like a thunderclap. All eyes turned to Elijah, their expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. He stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his face betraying none of the unease coursing through him. "What's this about, officer?" Elijah asked, his tone measured. "We have reason to believe you've been involved in fraudulent activity related to your organization's funding," Daniels said, holding up a folder. "We've received credible reports and evidence that require your immediate cooperation." The words struck like a blow. Elijah's breath caught as whispers erupted around him. He saw the doubt flicker in the faces of the donors and community leaders who had gathered to celebrate his achievements. The weight of Daniel's accusation hung heavy in the air, and Elijah knew the officer had chosen this moment deliberately, weaponizing the public setting to maximize the damage. "I don't know where you're getting your information," Elijah said, his voice steady but firm. "But I can assure you that Pinnacle Systems operates with full transparency. If there's a misunderstanding, I'm happy to address it." Daniel's smirk deepened. "Then you won't mind coming down to the station for questioning." Gasps rippled through the room. Elijah caught the eye of Mitchell, one of the reception's organizers, whose face was pale with shock. "Officer Daniels," Mitchell said, stepping forward, "this can't be right. Elijah has been nothing but a force for good in this community." Daniels turned to Mitchell, his tone dismissive. "This is a matter of law, Mr. Mitchell. I suggest you let us do our jobs." Elijah raised a hand to calm Mitchell, though his own anger simmered just beneath the surface. He met Daniel's gaze squarely. "I'll come with you, but know this. I won't allow baseless accusations to tarnish the work we've done here." Daniels didn't reply, but the smug glint in his eyes spoke volumes. As Elijah was escorted out of the room, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes on his back. Whispers followed him like a shadow, each one a reminder of how quickly doubt could spread. At the station, the interrogation room was sterile and cold, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. Elijah sat at the metal table, his hands clasped in front of him. Across from him, Daniels leaned back in his chair, flipping through the folder he had carried so conspicuously at the reception. "This isn't how I expected to spend my evening," Elijah said evenly. "Let's get to the point, shall we?" Daniels raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by Elijah's composure. "You're quite the figure in this town, aren't you? Big CEO, philanthropist, local hero, but even heroes have skeletons." "If you have evidence, show it," Elijah said. "Otherwise, this feels more like harassment than an investigation." Daniels leaned forward, his smirk fading. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Just because you've got money and a fancy title, you think the rules don't apply to you." Elijah's eyes narrowed. I think the rules should apply to everyone equally, officer. That's why I've spent my career advocating for accountability and equity. Now, if you can't produce evidence, I suggest we end this." Daniels slammed the folder onto the table, the sound echoing in the small room. "Don't push me, Reed. I know your type. Always playing the victim, claiming discrimination whenever things don't go your way." Elijah's jaw clenched, but he refused to rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I'm here voluntarily, officer. If you have questions, I'll answer them, but I won't sit here and let you twist this into something it's not." For hours, the questioning continued. Daniels pressed Elijah on every detail of Pinnacle Systems' operations, his tone laced with insinuations. But Elijah's answers were clear, concise, and unwavering. He knew his organization inside and out, and Daniels' attempts to trip him up only revealed the officer's own lack of preparation. By the time Elijah was released, the night had deepened. The station's parking lot illuminated by pale streetlights, Mitchell was waiting for him by his car, his expression a mix of relief and anger. "They let you go," Mitchell said. "What happened?" Elijah sighed, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "Daniels had nothing. This was a show, an attempt to discredit me and our work." Mitchell's fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't right, Elijah. We need to fight back." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "We will. But we have to be smart about it. If we respond with anger, they'll use it against us. We need facts, allies, and a strategy." Mitchell nodded, though his frustration was evident. "I'll start making calls. People need to know what's happening." As Elijah drove home, his mind raced. He knew this was bigger than a personal attack. It was a calculated effort to undermine everything he stood for. But he also knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. The stakes were higher than ever, and the next move would determine everything. The morning sun cut through the curtains of Elijah Reed's home office, illuminating the piles of neatly organized files, binders, and legal documents scattered across his desk. He sat in his leather chair, hands steepled as he stared at his phone, waiting for the call to connect. Every second ticked like an eternity, each one laden with the weight of the accusations leveled at him the night before. "Mitchell," he said when the line finally clicked, his voice low but resolute. "We need to move fast." "I'm already ahead of you," Mitchell replied, his tone edged with determination. "I've contacted some of the donors from last night. They're shaken, but most are still in our corner. A few want to see hard evidence before they commit to standing by you." "That's fair," Elijah said, though frustration lingered in his voice. "I can't blame them. Daniels made sure to plant enough doubt to make people second-guess everything we've built." "What's our next move?" Mitchell asked. Elijah leaned forward, his fingers brushing the edge of a manila folder on his desk. "We go public. Daniels wants to discredit me quietly, but if we shine a light on this, he won't have the luxury of operating in the shadows. I'll hold a press conference this afternoon." Mitchell hesitated. "That could work. But it's risky. If Daniels or anyone else digs up even the smallest mistake, they'll twist it to make you look guilty." "I know," Elijah said, his voice firm. "But transparency is our only weapon. If we're open about everything, they can't use it against us. Besides, this isn't just about me. It's about the systemic issues that let people like Daniels abuse their power." Mitchell exhaled, his agreement unspoken but clear. "All right. I'll handle the logistics. Let's make sure we're ready." As Elijah ended the call, his resolve solidified. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, not just for his reputation, but for the countless people who relied on Pinnacle Systems' initiatives. He wouldn't let them down. Hours later, the city square buzzed with anticipation. Reporters from local news outlets lined up with their cameras, their microphones poised, as the crowd gathered near a makeshift podium. Elijah stood just behind it, flanked by Mitchell and a few key supporters. The tension in the air was palpable. Every eye in the square trained on him. Elijah stepped forward, the faint murmur of the crowd silencing as he adjusted the microphone. His expression was calm, but determined, his voice steady as he began to speak. "Good afternoon," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today. I stand before you not as a CEO or a public figure, but as a man committed to truth and justice." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Last night, accusations were made against me, accusations that strike at the heart of everything my team and I have worked to build. I want to address these claims head-on. Pinnacle Systems has always operated with transparency and integrity, and we welcome any investigation into our practices. We have nothing to hide. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, while others whispered skeptically. But this situation, Elijah continued, his voice rising slightly, is about more than just one man or one organization. It's about a system that allows prejudice and power to dictate who is believed and who is silenced. I've spent my life fighting against these injustices, and I won't stop now. The crowd's energy shifted, growing charged with a mix of support and curiosity. But just as Elijah prepared to continue, a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. Officer Daniels appeared, flanked by several uniformed officers, his expression set in a grim mask. Daniels strode toward the podium, a folder clutched in his hand. "Mr. Reed," he called out, his voice cutting through the air, "I have new evidence that requires your immediate attention." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Daniels held the folder aloft, the moment dripping with theatrics. Elijah's heart pounded, but he maintained his composure, stepping down from the podium to meet Daniels. "What evidence?" Elijah asked, his tone even. Daniels handed over the folder with a triumphant smirk. Elijah opened it, scanning the contents quickly. His stomach churned as he realized what he was looking at. Fabricated invoices, doctored financial records, all designed to implicate him in embezzlement. "This is absurd," Elijah said, his voice rising. "These documents are fake." Daniels crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "That's not for you to decide. The court of public opinion is already forming its verdict, Mr. Reed." The crowd buzzed with confusion and alarm. Mitchell stepped forward, his face red with anger. "This is a setup, and you know it, Daniels. You've been targeting Elijah from the start." Daniels turned to Mitchell, his tone dripping with condescension. "If Mr. Reed has nothing to hide, he'll have his chance to prove it." Elijah clenched his fists, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at the crowd, their faces a mixture of doubt and support, and felt the enormity of what was at stake. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about standing against the systemic forces that sought to silence him. Taking a deep breath, Elijah raised his voice, addressing the crowd directly. "This is exactly what I've been talking about," he said, his words ringing with conviction. "A system that punishes people for daring to challenge it, that uses lies and fear to maintain control. I will not back down. I will fight this with every resource I have, because the truth is on my side." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their support bolstering Elijah's resolve. But as he stepped back, his mind raced with the enormity of what lay ahead. He knew Daniels wouldn't stop, and the battle for justice was just beginning. The courthouse lobby echoed with a sharp, cold finality as Elijah stepped through its heavy double doors. His footsteps clicked against the marble floor, drawing every gaze in the room. At the far end, Officer Daniels leaned casually against a pillar, his smirk as fixed as ever. He held a stack of papers in one hand, spinning them idly like a gambler with a winning hand. "Elijah Reed," Daniels called, his voice carrying through the space. "Right on time, always the professional." Elijah approached, his back straight and his expression neutral. "Let's skip the theatrics, Daniels. You've made your accusations, now let's get to the truth." Daniels stepped forward, his grin widening. "Oh, we're already there, Mr. Reed. I've got everything I need to prove you've been embezzling funds from your own foundation, the noble CEO, caught with his hand in the cookie jar." "How poetic." Elijah clenched his jaw, but kept his voice calm. "You've fabricated evidence to discredit me, Daniels, and when this is over, everyone will know." Daniels laughed, the sound sharp and derisive. "You think your little speech on the courthouse steps is going to save you? This is bigger than you, Reed people. Like you always think you can beat the system, but the system isn't built for you, it's built for people like me." Elijah's composure cracked, just slightly, as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. For all the systemic barriers Elijah had overcome, for all his achievements and accolades, the harsh reality was laid bare. Daniels believed the system would always protect him, no matter how corrupt his actions were. "People like me," Elijah repeated, his voice low. "You mean black men who build something of their own, who don't bow to your small-minded, bigoted view of the world?" Daniels took a step closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. I mean people who think they can waltz into places they don't belong and make themselves at home. You're a fraud, Reed. And deep down, you know it. Elijah's chest tightened, anger and frustration warring with his instinct for restraint. He knew he couldn't let Daniels provoke him into an outburst, not here, not now. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small voice recorder. "Say that again," Elijah said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "For the record." Daniel's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he laughed again, louder this time. "Cute trick, Reed, but you're not going to outsmart me." Elijah didn't reply. He pressed a button on the recorder, replaying the last 30 seconds of their conversation. Daniel's voice echoed back, his words dripping with condescension and prejudice. The few onlookers in the lobby stiffened, their murmurs rising as they exchanged glances. Elijah's calm remained unbroken as he stepped closer to Daniels. "You think the system will protect you," Elijah said, his voice rising just enough to carry. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, Daniels. And when it does, people will see you for exactly what you are." Daniel's expression hardened, his bravado slipping as the murmurs grew louder. But before he could reply, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Both men turned to see an older man in a crisp suit approaching. It was Judge Whitmore, a respected figure in the community who had overseen several of Darlington's most high-profile cases. His gaze swept over the scene, his sharp eyes narrowing as they landed on Daniels. "What's going on here?" Whitmore demanded, his tone carrying the weight of authority. Daniels straightened, his posture stiffening. "Just handling some business, Your Honor. Mr. Reed here is—" "A respected member of this community," Whitmore interrupted, his tone icy. "And you are dangerously close to overstepping your bounds, Officer Daniels." The room fell silent, every breath held as Whitmore turned his full attention to Elijah. "Mr. Reed, do you have a moment to step into my chambers?" Elijah nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." Inside the judge's chambers, the air was quieter, but no less charged. Whitmore gestured for Elijah to take a seat, his expression unreadable as he closed the door behind them. For a moment, the older man said nothing, simply studying Elijah with a mix of curiosity and scrutiny. "I've been hearing things," Whitmore began, his voice measured. "Accusations, rumors. Normally, I'd wait for due process, but given your reputation, and Officer Daniels, I thought it best to intervene." "I appreciate that," Elijah said, his tone cautious. "But you should know, Daniels is manufacturing this entire case against me." Whitmore nodded slowly, his gaze sharpening. "I suspected as much. His methods have always been questionable. But proving that is another matter." Elijah leaned forward, his resolve hardening. "I have evidence. Not just of my innocence, but of Daniel's corruption. Financial records, witness statements, even recordings of his threats. It's all here." He reached into his bag, pulling out a neatly organized file and sliding it across the desk. Whitmore opened it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. The minutes stretched into an eternity as Elijah watched, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, Whitmore looked up. "This is compelling," he admitted. "But it won't be enough to dismantle someone like Daniels. He has allies in high places, people who will protect him to preserve their own interests." "Then we make it public," Elijah said, his voice firm. "If the system won't hold him accountable, we'll force their hand." Whitmore's eyes narrowed, his expression thoughtful. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Reed. But I see you're not one to back down." "I've spent my life fighting for what's right," Elijah replied. "I'm not stopping now." That evening, Elijah held another press conference, this time armed with the evidence Whitmore had reviewed. The city square was packed, the crowd spilling into the surrounding streets. As Elijah took the stage, cameras flashed, microphones buzzed, and the tension crackled like static in the air. Elijah began with a calm but powerful declaration. "For too long, individuals like Officer Daniels have used their positions of power to oppress and intimidate today. That ends." He laid out the evidence with precision, his words slicing through the silence like a blade. The crowd erupted into cheers and gasps as each revelation landed, the weight of the truth pressing down like a tidal wave. In the distance, Elijah spotted Daniels watching from the shadows, his face pale and his jaw clenched. The man's confidence, so unshakable hours earlier, now seemed to crumble under the weight of his exposed lies. But Elijah wasn't finished. He turned to the crowd, his voice rising with conviction. This isn't just about one corrupt officer. It's about a system that allows corruption to thrive. Together, we can demand better, for ourselves, for our children, and for the generations to come. The cheers swelled. The energy electric. Elijah stepped back, his chest heaving, as the crowd chanted his name. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. But even as the moment surged with hope, Elijah knew the fight was far from over. Daniels wouldn't go down without a fight, and the forces that protected him were already moving. The real battle was just beginning. The municipal courtroom was silent, save for the rustle of papers and the occasional click of a pen. The air felt heavy, charged with the gravity of the moment, as Elijah Reed sat at the defendant's table. Across the room, Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair, his posture a picture of arrogant confidence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with a reputation for fairness, presided over the hearing with an expression as unreadable as stone. Elijah straightened his tie, glancing at his attorney, Maya Ellis, a sharp and relentless advocate who had been with him since the accusations first surfaced. Maya leaned in, her voice low but firm. "Stay calm. This is where we take control." Elijah nodded, centering himself as the bailiff called the court to order. Daniels was the first to take the stand. His demeanor was polished, his tone measured as he recounted a version of events that painted Elijah as a scheming opportunist. He spoke of supposed irregularities in Pinnacle Systems' financial records, embellishing his accusations with just enough plausible detail to sound convincing. When Daniels finished, Maya rose, her expression cool and composed. She approached the witness stand with deliberate steps, her voice steady, as she began her cross-examination. "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the room's silence, "you've presented yourself as an impartial enforcer of the law. Yet, isn't it true that you've had prior disputes with my client regarding his community initiatives?" Daniels smirked, leaning forward slightly. "Disputes? I wouldn't call them that. I've expressed concerns about some of Mr. Reed's projects, sure." "Concerns," Maya repeated, tilting her head. "And did these concerns include attending a city council meeting last year, where you openly opposed funding for one of Mr. Reed's educational programs?" Daniels stiffened slightly. "I was there as a private citizen. It's my right to express my opinion." "Indeed it is," Maya replied. "But isn't it also true that you attempted to pressure council members into withdrawing their support, citing unfounded allegations of impropriety?" Daniels's jaw tightened. "I acted within my rights. There was no pressure." Maya's gaze sharpened. "No pressure? Then explain why multiple council members reported feeling threatened by your presence, reports that were submitted to the city's ethics committee." Daniels faltered, his confident veneer cracking as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Maya seized the moment, her voice rising slightly. "Officer Daniels, you've accused my client of embezzlement. Yet, when asked to provide concrete evidence, all you've submitted are documents that forensic analysts have deemed suspiciously inconsistent. Would you care to explain how you obtained these documents?" Daniels' face flushed. "They were provided by a reliable source." Maya stepped closer, her tone now razor-sharp. "A source who conveniently remains anonymous. Correct, a source whose claims have not been corroborated by a single credible investigation?" Daniels didn't answer. His silence damning Maya turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a series of recordings obtained by my client, which demonstrate a clear pattern of harassment and bias by Officer Daniels toward Mr. Reed." The judge gestured for her to proceed, and Maya handed over a thumb drive. The courtroom held its breath as the bailiff played the first recording, the room filling with Daniels' voice. "People like him think they can waltz in and take over, not on my watch." The words hung in the air like a noxious cloud, their implication unmistakable. Daniels' face drained of color as a second recording played, this time capturing him threatening a council member over their support for one of Elijah's initiatives. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the tide of opinion shifting visibly. Elijah sat motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the table, as he watched Daniels squirm under the weight of his own words. When it was Elijah's turn to take the stand, the room fell silent once more. He spoke with quiet authority, recounting the work Pinnacle Systems had done to uplift underprivileged communities and address systemic inequities. He detailed the meticulous financial practices his organization followed, dismantling each of Daniel's claims with measured precision. But it was Elijah's closing words that left the greatest impact. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a system that allows power to go unchecked, that enables individuals like Officer Daniels to weaponize their authority against those they perceive as a threat. I've spent my life fighting for justice, and I won't stop now, not for myself, but for every person who has been silenced or sidelined by this kind of corruption." As he stepped down from the stand, the room buzzed with energy. The judge called for a brief recess, leaving Elijah to regroup with Maya and Mitchell in a small conference room. "You were incredible," Mitchell said, his voice filled with admiration. "I think you turned the whole thing around." Elijah exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "It's not over yet. Daniels isn't going to go quietly." Maya nodded. "He's desperate now, which makes him unpredictable, but the recordings were a turning point. The jury will see through him." When the court reconvened, Daniels's attorney attempted to mount a defense, but it was clear the damage had been done. The recordings, combined with Daniels' evasive testimony, painted a damning picture of a man willing to abuse his power to further his own agenda. But just as the proceedings seemed to be winding down, Daniels made a bold and desperate move. He stood abruptly, addressing the court in a raised voice. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, his composure completely unraveling. "Reed is playing the victim, but he's no saint. He's manipulating all of you." The judge banged her gavel, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Officer Daniels, you are out of order!" Daniels ignored her, turning to face Elijah directly. "You think you've won, don't you? But you'll never belong. People like you don't belong." The courtroom fell into stunned silence, Daniels' words echoing in the charged air. Elijah stood slowly, his expression calm but unyielding. "I belong here as much as anyone," Elijah said, his voice firm. "And no amount of hate or fear will change that." The tension in the room was palpable, as the judge ordered Daniels removed from the courtroom. As the officers escorted him out, Daniels' voice faded, but his words lingered. A stark reminder of the prejudice Elijah had fought against his entire life. The judge called for closing statements, and Maya delivered a powerful summation that left little doubt about the truth. Elijah watched the jury closely, noting the way their expressions shifted with each point she made. When the judge finally adjourned for deliberations, Elijah felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. As he stepped outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun bathed the steps in golden light. Reporters crowded around, their questions flying fast and furious. Elijah held up a hand, silencing them with a calm but resolute statement. "This is not just my fight," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is a fight for everyone who believes in justice, in accountability, and in the power of truth. No matter what happens next, I will continue to stand for what's right." The crowd erupted in applause, their support a balm to Elijah's weary spirit. But as he descended the steps, he knew the battle was far from over. The jury's verdict would determine much, but the larger fight, against systemic injustice and entrenched prejudice, was one that would continue for a lifetime. The courtroom was silent when the jury filed back in, their expressions solemn but resolute. Elijah sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Beside him, Maya Ellis gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat stiffly, his arrogance replaced by a grim, defiant silence. The judge nodded toward the foreperson, signaling for the verdict to be read. "In the matter of embezzlement and fraud," the foreperson began, her voice steady, "we find the defendant, Elijah Reed, not guilty." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps and murmurs erupted in the gallery, followed by a swell of applause from Elijah's supporters. Elijah let out a slow breath, the tension draining from his body as Maya gave him a triumphant nod. But the foreperson wasn't finished. "We also recommend that the court further investigate the actions of Officer Daniels, based on evidence presented during this trial." The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the room like a rising tide. Daniels' face turned ashen, his eyes darting around the room, as though searching for an escape. The judge's gavel banged sharply, calling for order. "This court takes those recommendations seriously," the judge said firmly. "Officer Daniels, I'm instructing the district attorney's office to open an inquiry into your conduct. You are hereby suspended pending further investigation." Daniels shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous." "Enough!" The judge's voice cut through the room like a whip. "You have overstepped your bounds, officer, and this court will not tolerate misconduct or abuse of power. Sit down, or you will be removed." Daniels sank back into his seat, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. Elijah watched him carefully, noting the cracks in the man's once impenetrable facade. It was a small victory, but an important one. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers as Elijah stepped onto the steps. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward him. Mitchell and Maya flanked him, their expressions a mix of pride and relief. Elijah raised his hand, quieting the noise. "Today is a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been silenced, doubted, or targeted because of who they are," he said, his voice carrying over the throng. "This case was never just about me. It was about holding those in power accountable and showing that justice must be for everyone, not just the privileged few." The crowd cheered, their applause a thunderous wave of support. Elijah scanned the faces before him, seeing hope and determination reflected back. The energy was electric, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of optimism. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his office, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. His desk was cluttered with documents, emails, and a growing stack of messages from supporters across the country. Pinnacle Systems' work had always been important, but now it felt more urgent than ever. Maya entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one down in front of Elijah, her expression softening. "You did it," she said. "You proved the truth, that's no small thing." Elijah nodded, though his smile was faint. "We won this battle. But the war isn't over. Daniels was just one piece of a much bigger problem." Maya leaned against the desk, studying him. "You're right. But what you've done here will have ripple effects. People are watching. Elijah. They're listening." He met her gaze, the weight of her words settling over him. "Then we keep going. We use this momentum to push for real change, policy reforms, oversight, education, whatever it takes." Maya nodded. "Count me in." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial sent shockwaves through the community. Officer Daniels resigned in disgrace, his name forever tied to the corruption and prejudice he had tried so hard to conceal. The district attorney's investigation uncovered a web of misconduct within the police department, leading to a series of reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Pinnacle Systems experienced a surge in support, with donations pouring in from across the country. Elijah used the funds to expand the organization's initiatives, launching new programs focused on education, mentorship, and community advocacy. His story became a rallying cry for those who had faced similar challenges, inspiring others to stand up and speak out. But the victory was not without its scars. Elijah found himself reflecting often on the cost of the fight, the sleepless nights, the strained relationships, the moments of doubt that had threatened to consume him. Yet, through it all, he had emerged stronger, more determined than ever, to use his platform for good. One afternoon, Elijah returned to the community center where his ordeal had begun. The building buzzed with activity, children laughing in the classrooms, while volunteers prepared meals in the kitchen. As he walked through the halls, he felt a profound sense of purpose. In the main lobby, a group of teenagers was gathered around a table, working on a mural project. One of them, a boy with bright eyes and an easy smile, looked up as Elijah approached. "Mr. Reed," the boy said, his voice filled with excitement. "We've been learning about your case in our social justice workshop. It's so cool what you did." Elijah smiled, crouching down to examine the mural. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "It took a lot of people working together, and now it's your turn to keep the fight going." The boy nodded, his expression serious. "We will." Elijah straightened, his heart swelling with pride. The work was far from over, but in moments like this, he saw the seeds of change taking root. As the sun set over the city, Elijah stood on the balcony of his home, gazing out at the skyline. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also been filled with moments of triumph and connection. He knew the road ahead would be just as difficult, but he was ready. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a message from Mitchell. "Big meeting tomorrow with the city council, ready to make some waves?" Elijah smiled, typing back, "Always." As he set the phone down, he took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. The fight for justice was ongoing, but he was no longer alone. The community was with him, and together, they would continue to push forward. The world was vast and complicated, but Elijah Reed was ready to face it, armed with truth, resilience, and the unshakable belief that change was not just possible, but inevitable. Elijah Reed stood at the podium, gazing out at a crowd that seemed larger than life. It was a crisp fall evening, the golden hues of sunset painting the sky behind him, as the city square brimmed with energy. The faces in the crowd were diverse, young and old, hopeful and battle-worn, unified by a shared purpose. They were here not just to hear his words, but to be part of something bigger. A movement for change. As Elijah adjusted the microphone, a familiar steadiness settled over him. This was the same steadiness that had carried him through his darkest moments, the same resolve that had fueled his fight for justice. He took a deep breath and began. "Good evening," he said, his voice strong but warm. "Standing here tonight, I am reminded of a simple truth. Resilience is not just the ability to endure. It is the courage to rise, again and again, no matter how many times you are knocked down." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers resonating across the square. Elijah smiled, but his expression quickly turned serious as he continued. "Over the past months, we have faced challenges that tested our resolve. We've seen what happens when prejudice and power collide, when those entrusted with authority use it not to protect, but to oppress. And we've learned that justice is not automatic. It must be fought for, demanded, and defended." His words hung in the air, drawing the crowd into a collective reflection. For Elijah, this was more than a speech. It was a culmination of his journey, a moment to articulate the lessons he had learned and the vision he carried forward. In the weeks following the trial, Elijah had spent countless hours meeting with community leaders, policymakers, and activists. The revelations about Officer Daniels had sparked a wave of outrage, leading to deeper investigations into systemic misconduct within the local police department. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. Resignations, policy reforms, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to ensure accountability. For Elijah, these victories were significant but bittersweet. They were hard-won, and they came with the knowledge that the work was far from over. The system that had allowed Daniels to thrive was deeply entrenched, and dismantling it would require persistence, collaboration, and unwavering commitment. But amidst the challenges, there were moments of hope. Pinnacle Systems had become a beacon of progress, expanding its programs to serve more communities than ever before. Donations poured in from across the country, bolstered by the story of Elijah's perseverance. New partnerships were forged with organizations dedicated to education, legal advocacy, and systemic reform. And perhaps most importantly, Elijah had witnessed the power of collective action. The trial had brought people together, neighbors, strangers, allies, united by a shared belief in justice. It was a reminder that change was not the work of one individual, but of many, each contributing their voice, their effort, and their heart. As Elijah spoke to the crowd, he reflected on how the journey had shaped him. He had always believed in justice, but the ordeal had deepened his understanding of its complexity. Justice was not just about winning a case or exposing wrongdoing. It was about creating a world where everyone could thrive, free from fear and prejudice. "I want to share something with you," Elijah said, his tone softening. "During the hardest days of this fight, I often found myself asking, is it worth it? Can one person really make a difference? And every time, the answer came not from within me, but from the people around me. From you." He gestured to the crowd, his voice filling with emotion. "From the teacher who stood up for her students. From the parent who marched for a better future. From the young person who said, 'I want to make things better.' You are the reason I kept going. You are the proof that together, we can achieve the impossible." The crowd erupted again, their cheers blending with chants of his name. Elijah took a moment to let the energy wash over him, grounding himself in the collective strength of the people before him. Later that night, Elijah found himself walking through the same community center where his journey had begun. The halls were quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. He paused in front of a mural painted by a group of local teenagers, a vibrant depiction of unity and resilience. The words, "Strength in Diversity," were emblazoned across the top, a fitting mantra for the community's spirit. As he stood there, he thought about the path ahead. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt, but there would also be victories, small and large, each one a step toward the world he envisioned, and he knew he wouldn't be walking the path alone. Mitchell's voice broke his reverie. "There you are, I figured I'd find you here." Elijah turned, smiling at his friend. "Just needed a moment to reflect." Mitchell nodded, his expression warm but serious. "You've done something incredible, Elijah, but you know this is just the beginning." "I do," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "And I'm ready." Mitchell grinned. "Good. Because the city council meeting tomorrow is going to be a fight." Elijah chuckled, the sound carrying a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The story of Elijah Reed was not one of perfection or easy victories. It was a story of resilience, of standing up against the odds and refusing to be silenced. It was a reminder that change was messy, difficult, and often slow. But it was also possible. For the people who had watched his journey, Elijah's story became a source of inspiration. It was a call to action for communities across the country to examine their own systems, to question their own biases, and to fight for a more just and equitable society. As Elijah left the community center that night, the city lights stretched out before him, a mosaic of possibility. The world was far from perfect, but it was full of people who believed in its potential. And for Elijah, that was enough. With each step he took, he carried the weight of his experiences, the lessons he had learned, and the voices of those who had stood with him. He was not just a man who had fought for justice. He was a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to give up. And as he disappeared into the night, his story remained, a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the enduring belief that a better world was within reach.